It's the place to go.
All right, let's begin. Let's get right to it. It's late at night, so we'll start the classes on time, more or less. Just quickly to recap, just in a few minutes, what we did last week for those who weren't here, and we'll move on this week. We began with an introduction. We gave a little bit of a biography of the Rambam, and what was important, what was critical about that biography that we need to repeat tonight, is the Rambam was 24 years old when he began to write the Parsha Mishnayos. His commentary to the Mishnah was written in his youth, relative to the Rambam's entire life. And this is critical because we'll see throughout this series many times where it would appear that Maimonides or the Rambam is soser himself. He contradicts himself in his later work, which is the Yad. His most famous work, depending on who you ask, but among the Torah world, perhaps his most famous work is his halachic work, the Yad. Among many others, the most famous work is the Moreh Nevuchim, the guide to the perplexed, for the perplexed. What's also interesting is that the Parsha Mishnayos, where the Yisodot, which is what he calls the animamins, he calls them foundations. He alludes to the fact that they are ikrim, which we'll discuss tonight. He alludes to that in his introduction to the principles of faith. But each principle is called Yesod Aleph, Yesod Beis, Foundation 1, Foundation 2. But these were written in Arabic. And this too will be very critical for our understanding of the principles of faith. And we'll see that many Rishonim, many early commentators, many early detractors to the Rambam had a different understanding of what he said or what he was trying to say. So between the ages, at some point between 24 and 31, or 23 and 30, depending on who you ask, was when he wrote the Yud Gimel Ikrim, as we know them today, as the animamins. We also, again, very briefly last week, we're out of paper, so we don't have the copies. We'll make them again next week, and I would advise you that you keep those copies for each week. In any event, we also pointed out that the Rambam, this was not his first venturing into the world of philosophy at this young age. He had already written the Igeres Hashmad, the letter which was so central and is so central in Jewish history to the North African Jewish community, disagreeing with the rabbi who said that those who refuse to accept the Islamic faith by punishment of the sword and openly accepted it and privately rejected it, privately maintained their religious and Jewish identity, this rabbi got up and said they are apostates, they have to be excommunicated, put in cherem, and the Rambam wrote a scathing rebuke of this rabbi and a beautiful defense for these people. And there he explains a very lenient approach of how we view Jewish theology and when it is okay, at least after the fact, to accept someone into the fold even if they outwardly rejected Judaism. And this has, of course, a lot of ramifications throughout Jewish history with the Marranos, etc., etc. One last point that we mentioned last week that I need to bring up again, and that is the Rambam, and we saw this inside in the copies we had last week, at the end of the Yesodot, at the end of his foundations, he states the purpose behind these ikrim, the purpose behind these foundations of Jewish theology as formulated by him, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, is that in order to be considered a member of Klal Yisrael, in order to be considered a member of the Jewish people, not just as a nationality but as a religion, one has to accept these 13. And if you do not accept any one of these 13, you are no longer a member of Klal Yisrael and you lose everything that comes with membership. You lose a share in the world to come. You lose the ability of, let's say, v'ahavta re'echa kamocha, that someone should love you and care about you, and you can't lend with ribis. All the laws that go with it apply to you should you believe in these 13 principles of theology, and if you don't, they are dismissed. That's very, very harsh. And just remember his Igeres Hashmad as well, which was somewhat lenient. And sometime as we go on, we go through, as tonight we're going to start with number 1, as we go through each and every of the 13 principles of faith, you'll see what the Rambam meant and how he meant it and why he chose his words the way he does. So, we said last week that there were many people who disputed the entire enterprise of principles of faith. And this week, but again, quickly, we're going to end with this introduction very shortly, and then we'll go on to the first of the principles. Let's discuss the 4 reasons, as I see there are 4 reasons why various scholars throughout the generations disputed the Rambam and his 13 principles of faith. So the first type of disputant are those who believed that there is no such thing as an ikar. There's no such thing as something which is fundamental to Judaism. There are 613 mitzvos, therefore there are 613 ikrim, and as we all know, anybody who doesn't believe in any of these 613 mitzvahs. Anybody who doesn't believe that the entire Torah, the Torah in its entirety, came from Moses at Sinai, and as we pointed out last week, that is an expression used, even though, as we'll see, Moshe did not write the entire Torah, we'll get to that by the 8th principle, is not a believer. So we don't need the 13 principles of faith. What's interesting is, and again, between these two books, is the following. They both quote the opinion of the Arizal. I think we mentioned the Arizal last week. I think we may have ended with this, that the Arizal states, and in fact, if you look in the Siddur Ari, which Lubavitch use in their shuls, there is a very important piyut, a very important poem, which is excised from the text. They do not mention it in their Siddur, and that is the piyut of Yigdal. I think we mentioned this last week, that Yigdal, as we all know, is an abridged version, a poetic version of the 13 principles of faith. They believe, for whatever reason, based on the Arizal, and it's unclear, and we'll see in a moment what the reason of the Arizal was, that Yigdal should not be said. In the Siddur of the Beis Yaakov, we mentioned the Siddur in another class on a different topic, actually a topic which was the Siddur in history and halacha. This is the Siddur of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Yaakov Emden lived in the 18th century, just a brilliant work where he writes what he believes to be the Siddur and the Nusach that we should use, a very Kabbalistic commentary, a halachic commentary, a wonderful work by Rabbi Yaakov Emden. As you can see, it's very, very large. In his introduction to the Siddur, in his Sulam, base kale, in his ladder to the house of God, the house of the Lord, he writes about the fundamentals of Jewish faith, but somewhat paradoxically, he also dismisses the Rambam's 13 principles of faith. And if you look in the Chemda Tova, the book from Lakewood, which is the modern book that discusses the Rambam's 13 principles of faith, the first footnote he has in this book is this Siddur Beis Yaakov from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, where he states that Rabbi Yaakov Emden quotes from the Arizal two things. Number one is that Yaakov Emden says on his own that Maimonides composed Yigdal, which is very bizarre. And in addition, he quotes from the Arizal that you cannot say Yigdal. Why was the Arizal against it? According to Rabbi Halpern from Lakewood, the reason why the Arizal was against Yigdal and why Lubavitch and anybody who follows the Nusach of the Arizal does not say it is because he was against the entire enterprise of Ikrim. He was against the entire enterprise of suggesting that these 13 are more fundamental than any others. What is interesting is that in Mark Shapiro's book, he also mentions the Arizal. He, however, doesn't go by way of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, but he looks at the source. What did the Arizal say? Now, as we all know, the Arizal wrote next to nothing. Most of what we have from the Arizal comes from his student, Reb Chaim Vital. And Reb Chaim Vital says why the Arizal was against the piyut of Yigdal, and that's because he was against piyutim. The Arizal didn't like poems. The only poems that he accepted were poems that were written by scholars who lived in the days of the Talmud. Yeah?
What reason might there be for not liking Judaism, just aesthetic? Especially for a follower of the Baal Shem Tov.
Right. So I'll share with you something, although briefly, and I was mentioning this to someone the other day. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it goes into something else, but a very important question that you're asking. First of all, we should point out that Rambam himself was not very happy with the poets. He writes, and we mentioned this in the Shabbos Shuvah Drasha as well, when we were talking about Unisana Tokev, that people, according to the Rambam, and the Ibn Ezra, which shouldn't surprise people, also says this, people take the poems that we sing way too seriously. That many times, and again, most people disagree with this, but this is an opinion written in their Sfarim, and where they say that people take it too seriously and that they were written usually by people who couldn't succeed in the academic Torah world. And it's very plausible that they got things wrong. So it's one thing to say that they're wonderful and they're written in holiness and they seek to find Kabbalistic interpretations to various events in the Jewish calendar. But you could also say at the same time, don't take it too far. They try hard and they succeed in most places. An example I'll give you is that, as we said in the Shabbos Shuvah Drasha, that in Nisana Tokef we say Tshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah. But if you look at the source, it's Tefillah, Tefillah, tshuva, utzedakah. Tshuva does not come first. And I used to spend time trying to figure out why Reb Amnon switched the order. It could just be he made a mistake. And the Rambam says that's what you should say when you see something like this. So the first answer to your question, Yoni, is that the Arizal felt that we'll give too much credence, especially when dealing with something like the Yud Gimel Ikrim. So it's actually the exact opposite of the Reb Halpern's work. It's not because he didn't agree with it, it's because he did agree with the Rambam. And he was afraid someone would get it wrong. If we rely on poets to teach our children the 13 principles of faith, someone would get it wrong, which is just a completely different reading between these two books. Another reason why, and if you look at the language of Chaim Vital, it seems more along these lines. This is what I was speaking to someone the other day. We were talking about the tzava of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid left an ethical will. It's almost more than an ethical will. It was a halachic will almost. Yehuda HaChassid was a member of the Hasidic movement, but the Hasidic movement that many people aren't aware of. I think it was about the 12th, 11th century, there was a Hasidic movement. Pious individuals who would fast and who would study and meditate. Didn't last long, and there's very little written about this movement. And Yehuda HaChassid was and is the most celebrated member of this movement. And many of his works we know. And Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid wrote a tzava. And in this tzava, in his ethical will, he tells us certain things that many of us here may know and may have thought it comes from the Talmud, but really it doesn't. It comes from Yehuda HaChassid. So one of them is, and this one I never knew, and I said this in a shir a few months ago, and two people said that their grandmother used to always tell them this. I never heard this before. He says that if you ever leave your house and you realize you forgot something, you shouldn't turn around and get it. Anybody ever heard of that? What? You've heard that? See that? This comes from Yehuda HaChassid. The most famous, probably, of the charges in his ethical will is that you should not marry someone. A man should not marry a woman who has the same name as his mother, and a girl should not marry a boy who has the same name as her father. And this is a very common question, and the famous joke is, Moshe Feinstein said he would always get this question, Moshe Feinstein. And it's interesting, Moshe Feinstein's son-in-law, his name is one of his son-in-law, Moshe. So clearly he wasn't so concerned, although it was Moshe David Moshe. In any event, Moshe Feinstein used to say, I wish the entire Shulchan Aruch was printed in the Tzava of Yehuda HaChassid, because then everybody will take the Shulchan Aruch as seriously as they take the Tzava of Yehuda HaChassid. But the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Cheskel Landau, he was the Moshe Feinstein of his generation, the leading authority in his generation. This is in the 18th century. He was the rabbi in Prague. He receives a letter, Halayla Hazeh, he says, I received your letter. He's speaking to a student relating to a shidduch with this question, with a boy who was going to marry a girl with the same name as his mother. He says, Ahuvi Talmidi, my beloved, my student. I'll just translate this to save ourselves time. If not, for my love for you, you should know it's not my way. Lo hashe ben yonam keilu. I don't usually answer these types of questions. Things that have no source in the Talmud or the authorities. And he says, Da Talmidi, you should know, and I want to read this in Hebrew, and you should know, Hachaviv, the one who was there to me, talking to the student, and these words should be, Chakukim aluach libcha lizikaron. The words I'm about to say should become engraved in the tablet of your heart, so that you should always remember them. Haklal hagadol, this very important principle. She'ein l'chol chachamim she'achar Talmud. There is no scholar, no matter how great, who exists after the closing of the canonization of the Talmud. None of them have reshus lomer davar neged ha-Talmud. And anybody who says anything has permission to say anything that the Talmud doesn't say or to go against the Talmud. And nothing is sacred here. No matter how holy the person is, we don't care. The fact is, many things that Yehuda HaChassid says has no source, and we're allowed to say we don't care where it comes from. You could completely ignore it. And he does go on, the Rabbi Yehuda, to try to find reasoning behind Yehuda HaChassid. I have a book that I purchased from Eretz Yisrael from the Otzer HaPoskim Institute, which seeks to find sources for every one of his rules. But Rabbi Yehuda famously says that this tzava, this will, was written for his children. That al pi Kabbalah, in the mystical world, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid saw that for his children, such marriages and other things that he mentions, he saw would be dangerous for them, and for us to swallow it up whole for ourselves and the entire nation, says Rabbi Yehuda, that's the mistake. But the point I wanted to make is that Rizal may have felt especially when it came to poems, that many times things will be said in such work that we will take seriously, and sometimes more seriously than it needs to be taken. And this is something that could be very dangerous, because we have nothing if not for the Talmud itself. Okay, so that's number one, the one type of person who would be against the 13 principles of faith. Number two is that those who believe there's nothing wrong with setting up Ikrim. The Rambam did a very good thing setting up foundations of our faith, but he got the wrong list. Either he said things in his 13 principles of faith that shouldn't be there, that do not belong or shouldn't be titled as a principle of faith, or it's incomplete. There are things that he is missing. It's interesting that the Rambam chose 13 principles of faith. Someone mentioned to me the other week, he got confused. He thought the class was on the 13 midos of Hashem, the 13 attributes of God. And in fact, the Shloh HaKadosh says that the 13 principles of faith, the Rambam didn't choose this for nothing. He chose this to parallel the 13 attributes of God. And there are many who try, and the Shloh is one of them, to show how each one of the attributes of God match up with Maimonides' 13 principles of faith. Well, that's not a class for now, but a very interesting aside. In any event, the most famous of those who believed in the concept of the 13 principles of faith, but thought the Rambam got it wrong, was Rabbi Yosef Albo, who wrote the book Sefer HaIkrim, the book of fundamentals of faith. And he basically says the following. He says, really, all faiths, all systems of faith have a tzad hashava, as it were, kaviyachol. They have a common denominator, which is the following three fundamentals, which every religion has to have. He says, number one, they have to believe in a God, and within that belief, how that God relates to the world. Every religion has that as its fundamental, or one of its fundamentals. Number two, there has to be some type of revelation, or some type of individual who brings that revelation. That's number two of what every religion has to have as its fundamental, one of its fundamentals. And number three is some type of reward and punishment system, which translates into some type of immortality of the soul, punishment in this world, punishment in the next world. This is in the Sefer HaIkrim what he says. And the challenge is which religion explains these three in the best way, the most truthful way, and the way that could fight challenges. And that's what he seeks to prove in the Sefer HaIkrim, that is Yiddishkeit, that is Judaism. But those three, he believes, if you distill it down, if you boil it down, every religion is going to have these three fundamentals of faith. And many things the Rambam says really doesn't make it distinct, Judaism, from other religions, and that's what he focuses on in his book. The third type of person who would dispute it, from what I've seen from the Rishonim, is just a general discomfort with the entire enterprise. And one of the things that you see brought down is, the Rambam, we pointed this out in, I don't know if I brought it here this week, in the, here it is, in the R.D.A. Kaplan book, which I love that he did this, and Chemda Tova does this too in the Hebrew edition, is he shows you, like, here's the 9th principle of faith. So he doesn't have any commentary, R.D.A. Kaplan. All he does is he'll bring down the version of Yigdal. He'll bring down Maimonides' original version of the text in his Yesodot, in his commentary to the Mishnah, where it all comes from. And then he'll bring down in the codes, where we find this in Halacha, specifically in Maimonides' codes, in the Yad, where Maimonides brings this down. And the concern that these who dispute the Rambam say is, I don't understand how this is different from Halacha. You already have this in the Yad. The Code of Jewish Law tells us that someone who believes this is seen in a way in X, or is seen as Y. What is added by these 13 principles of faith? It's almost setting up two systems of law. You have the halachic law, and then you have philosophical law, and it's just this general discomfort. And a part of this discomfort is something else, and this is actually very ironic, considering that this came from the Rambam, and that is the following. Tell me if we mentioned this last week, and if we did, we only mentioned it briefly, so I want to expand on it. And that is based on the Rambam himself had a fear of the 10 utterances, better known as the Seres HaDibros, the 10 commandments. Did we mention this last week? So very, very briefly, 30 seconds or less, the Rambam believed that you should not stand up for the 10 commandments because people will believe that these are the central beliefs of Judaism. And he wrote a tshuva saying you shouldn't stand up for them. Many disagree. Moshe Feinstein explains that many other Rishonim disagreed. Typically in this shul and other shuls, they clap and they say everybody to stand up. But the Rambam himself was aware of a concern of setting aside individual mitzvahs as special. And the Hamonam, the mass, is not being sophisticated enough to understand that they are special, they are unique. Better said, they are unique, but they're not special. That type of distinction is very difficult for the unlearned to understand. And yet the Rambam wasn't afraid to say what he says here. And this is actually, that question in particular is something the Chemda Tova in his introduction spends the most amount of time on. I should point out that he does mention this, Mark Shapiro, and he gives a nice translation of the Maharil. The Maharil also was bothered by this. I'll read it to you inside his translation. Maharil writes, the rhymes and poems that people write in Yiddish on the unity of God and the 13 principles, would that they be not written. For most of the ignorant believe that all of the commandments depend on them, and they despair of various positive and negative commandments. Like what? This is not religion, how to separate egg from its shell on Shabbos. Religion is yigdal. Religion is these grandiose ideas, and they just dismiss halacha, such as he gives the example of tzitzis and tefillin, the study of Torah. They dismiss all this, and they believe that they fulfill their personal obligation by saying these simple rhymes, so long as they say it with kavanah, with intent. So you see that the Maharil was very much bothered by this concern that people are going, even though it's very holy, so he doesn't disagree with the 13 principles per se as they were written, but he just disagrees that it was said out loud. Certain things shouldn't be said out loud. And the fourth type of person who disputes the Rambam, and this is interesting, the Abarbanel, more than most, deals with this. The Abarbanel, Don Isaac Abarbanel, he wants to know, and I know he touched on this very briefly, what does the word ikr mean? So there are a few possibilities. One thing is ikr can mean foundation, that without these, the entire religion collapses on itself. And he says that's impossible to say. How could the Maimonides say that Judaism will disappear without these 13? It would not disappear without Shabbos? We all know Reb Haigon's famous idea, as much as Jews kept Shabbos, Shabbos has kept the Jews, and we pointed out this last week in more detail. The Rambam himself says that Shabbos is one of the Ikrim in the Torah. He says this in the Yad. So the language of Ikrim is very difficult. The other option is it represents Ikr v'tafel. When you have a cereal and milk, you only make a bracha on the mazonos, you don't make a bracha on the milk. It's called Ikr v'tafel. What's important is there, and what's not as important is completely ignored in halacha. If he means that, that's also horrible. He can't say that these 13 principles are important, everything else is not important. That's what the Maharil's whole concern was. So the Abarbanel suggests, and Michael Pasquin suggested this last week, that Ikrim really means klalim. It means general principles. This is problematic for any number of reasons. We don't have to go into this right now. The Abarbanel, that's what the Abarbanel says in Rosh Hashanah. He says that all he means is general principles. But the Abarbanel says something else which is unbelievable. The Abarbanel says that the 13 principles of faith, it's so funny because it comes directly the opposite view of the Maharil. With the Maharil thought the 13 principles of faith were written for the scholars, and it's the Hamonam, the masses, that are going to confuse them. Whereas the Abarbanel says no. The 13 principles of faith, of course these aren't the Ikrim. Of course Judaism is far more complex than that. But the masses needed something that they could relate to. The 13 principles of faith, of course, are incomplete, says the Abarbanel. But it was something that they could touch. It was something that people who do not have an education could relate to. They needed a creed. And as we saw last week, in the Art Scroll, of all places, in their introduction, their footnote, in the end of Shachris to Ani Maamin, which we said for those who weren't here, we don't know who wrote Ani Maamin, that the Rambam formulated this not because this has always been in our history, but because Christians and Muslims and other religions were influencing our own, and our masses that greatly pined for something that they could touch. So this Abarbanel is fascinating, and if you think this is very strange, we find this in Judaism. In Chabad you find this division between the masses and the unique and special ones. So an example of this would be if you daven in a Lubavitch shul, and other shuls as well, but there's a reason why I'm choosing Lubavitch, and the Chazan is repeating the Shemona Esrei, and they're saying Berchas Kohanim. How do you answer? Now we answer Kein Yehi Ratzon. How do they answer? Amen. And there's a reason for this. It's a very interesting debate, because how could you say Amen, we say, if he's not a Kohen davening for the Amud? Right? That's why we only say Kein Yehi Ratzon. Whereas maybe if a Kohen's davening, that should change. So if you look in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Shulchan Aruch that Lubavitch uses, his Rabbi Liadi's commentary to the Shulchan Aruch, written, it would seem, for the masses and for his Hasidim, it states, he brings down this debate, and he says you should say Kein Yehi Ratzon.
Even if they're doing it, you should do it. If you're down.
No. He's saying about this dispute, should you say Amen or Kein Yehi Ratzon? He says you should say like us, Kein Yehi Ratzon. So why do Lubavitchers say Amen? Because in the Siddur, in the Siddur, the Nusach Hari Siddur, he states you should say Amen. And if you ask a Lubavitcher, this is not a secret, they'll tell you the Shulchan Aruch Harav was written for the masses, but the secrets of Chasidus, just for the Chasidim, is reserved in the Nusach Hari. And that's a very beautiful idea, that the Shulchan Aruch Harav didn't look at non-Chasidim or non-Lubavitchers as nobodies. He actually wrote a book for them. And the Shulchan Aruch Harav was written for them. And in fact, in every yeshiva circle, the Mishnah Berurah is used just as much as the Shulchan Aruch Harav, at least by rabbis.
But if you're davening by them, you should adopt their.
That's a separate issue. Yes. You should, anything out loud, you should always adopt the place that you're davening by. I really wanted to finish with this introduction, but one point I can't leave off, and this is probably the most fundamental debate these two books have in their introduction, and that has to do with a tinik shenishba. This is a very interesting question. If the Rambam is suggesting, as he seems to be saying, that in order to gain entry as a member of the Jewish nation, you have to arrive at these 13 principles of faith, if we could word it like that, you could word it different ways, then how do you deal with someone who was raised completely unaware of Judaism? Now, in Jewish law, that's a very important concept, something which is very unique to our times, which of course existed in previous generations, but not like we have it today, where people are raised completely divorced from halacha and Judaism. So in the Talmudic language, it's expressed as a tinik shenishba, a child who's held captive, who knows nothing from Judaism. All the laws of those who reject Judaism don't apply to them. I was reading a book by Christopher Buckley about his parents, William F. Buckley and his mother. It's called Losing Mom and Pup. And he says in the book that Bill Buckley's best friend was this Jew. And they would talk and go for walks, and they would come to Manhattan, and they would sit together. And Bill Buckley once said to his son, you know, it really bothers me as a Catholic that I know that he's damned to hell because he's Jewish. And later on in the book, he says that my father one day called me so excited that he asked this priest, because he was so bothered by this idea of a Jew and his best friend not having a share in whatever, that kingdom. And the priest said, this I forget the phrase, it was a Latin term, this very similar idea that he doesn't know better. He was raised as a Jew, what could you do? Never, he's a Jew. So he's going to have a share in the world to come. But lahadal the netzach, we have this idea. I would even be so bold to say we had this idea first. In any event, and the two books discuss, does this apply to principles of faith? If we're saying that you don't gain entry to the world to come, you're not considered a member of the klal if you don't believe these things, what if someone was raised without any knowledge of this? Or was raised by parents who are atheists and who taught them to be an atheist and who taught them about the documentary theory of the Bible? They don't know better. That's how they were indoctrinated. How do we view this? And this is a great, a fascinating debate. And Rabbi Chanan Wasserman wrote many books. He was killed by the Nazis. His works on the Talmud are studied in every yeshiva every day across the globe. This is his work called Kovetz Maimarim, which he deals with many concepts, Mashiach and philosophy. And he asks an even more fundamental question. He says, Lo aleinu, a child who has not reached the level of intellect to even ponder these things. Are you suggesting that, like Christians, lahavdil, we are a religion of a creed, that if, God forbid, a child dies young, they have no share in the world to come, and when they're alive, they're not considered members of the Jewish nation? This is very difficult to say. In fact, it's impossible to say. And we'll get to this by the second and third principle, how they arrive at the various conclusions. One thing I want to share with you is what Shapiro brings in his book, and passage from Rav Kook. And Rav Kook says, now I just need to find it. Here we go. Know that, as far as the halacha is concerned, it is absolutely forbidden and a festering sore for one to even cast a doubt concerning the truth of the content of a perfect faith. However, we do not find our sages deeming such individuals heretics. Only one who definitely denies, that is, he rejects, who decides, or in the yeshiva vernacular, who makes a hachlata, who makes a complete and utter decision. So we don't have time to read through the whole thing, but you get the point where he's going. Even the most stringent view on how to read the Rambam, it's not that someone who doesn't believe or someone who has doubts. It's talking about, the Rambam is talking about someone who rejects. So it's almost as if we're all born into this. As the Mishnah says, all Jews have a share in the world to come, and you can only leave the fold. You actually have to physically or verbally do something to reject the fold and leave the fold, and that's when all this will apply to you. Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
They reject and publicly so and prophesy rejection. Am I correct?
Why would you have to go that far?
Well, I mean, I've heard it said that way.
I've never heard that.
You have to making a case to other people to disobey.
Why? That's a sin. One of the 613 commandments, someone who tries to convince people to serve other gods. But this has nothing to do with other people. This is between you and God. Yeah, Yoni.
One question. As far as that growing up in ignorance, there's a lot of gray there. There's everything in between. At what point do you say this counts, that doesn't?
I mean, it's a great question. Reb Dessler famously has a brilliant concept called Nakudat HaBechira. I don't have a temptation to eat at McDonald's. Right? I never ate non-kosher food, and there's no desire for me, no matter how hungry I am, and I'm on a trip away for vaad work, and I'm in the middle of nowhere, and I'm starving, and I pass by a McDonald's, and there's a big picture of an Angus beef cheeseburger. It looks good, but I'm not fighting a Yetzer Hara, I'm not fighting. And Dessler says, I get no reward for that, because that's not my little circle of free will. Everybody has a little circle of free will, and it works to the other extreme, meaning there are things that for everybody has their own things that, for whatever reason, these are sins that are way beyond where presently they're able to accomplish. When someone's just becoming religious, you don't want to tell them to take on everything at once. That's beyond their nakudat habechira, and they're not going to be judged for that. So both negative and positive, you're not going to be judged. Every person, everybody has to understand, as Yoni put it, their own gray area, is judged in a very small area where free will actually exists. And it's in that area that we're judged. And Rav Dessler says our goal is to move that ball. Keep moving that ball so we have a stronger and stronger, at least positive area of free will, or a higher and higher area of free will. And this actually explains the Talmud that the greater the person, the greater his evil inclination. What the Talmud is saying is the greater the person, the greater evil inclination, because you move that ball, your free will has been expanded. In any event, now let's begin to the first principle of faith. Just a few minutes. We'll start it tonight. And as I said last week, we'll do every other week, we'll get to a new one. So this will take 2 weeks. Maybe a little bit more because we're starting so late. So the first one is, I'm going to read the Maamin inside. I'll read it from Yigdal. The Yigdal says, great is the living God and praised. He exists, yet his existence has no time. That's in Yigdal. In the commentary of the Mishnah, and this is Ari Kaplan's translation, the first principle involves belief in the existence of God. There's nothing more fundamental in a religion than the existence of God and the belief in the existence of God. Continues Maimonides, there is a being, perfect in every possible way, who is the ultimate cause of all existence. All existence depends on him and is derived from him. It is inconceivable, says the Rambam, that he not exist. Now, I should point out, the Rambam is not describing God here. He is telling you what your obligation is to believe. You are obligated to believe that it is inconceivable that he not exist. And he goes on to say that it's not only important to know that he exists, but that we all exist due to him. Should he not exist, everything will disappear, even the angels, even the Seraphim, even the stars, things that are holy. We have to remember that one of the great paradoxes of Judaism and the fundamental of Judaism is the paradox of Judaism, that the soul, the spiritual, could coexist with the physical, the body. That heaven and earth collide. This is something that has been discussed by the Jewish philosophers for centuries, Rambam in particular. This is at the core of our belief, and anybody who's a thinking Jew understands that is the most difficult principle to grasp. But the idea, as the Rambam puts it, that even though God is heavenly, God is non-physical, our existence, our physical existence, is tied into his existence. But in layman's terms, the first principle of belief is belief in God. So let's discuss briefly tonight what is incorporated in this belief of Amunah and Hashem. So the most famous principle relating to this principle is the obligation of belief in God a mitzvah? Anybody? I'm sure you've all heard this before. This is actually a debate. Many scholars believe that out of the 613 mitzvahs, belief in God is not and cannot be one of them. Because in order to believe in 613 commandments, a prerequisite has to be, before you believe in a mitzvah, you have to believe in a mitzvah. That has to come first. You first have to believe in a God. So that has to come before the Torah. The Rambam, of course, disagrees, as we see here, and also in the Yad, in his halachic work, in his book on mitzvos, he counts belief in God as one of the mitzvos. Yeah. Pasuk of Shema, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the first of the 10 utterances, states that I am Hashem, your God. You're asking as a question? You have to love Hashem. That's a different commandment. no one's denying, it's a good point, no one's denying the Bahag, who argues on the Rambam and says that belief in God is not a mitzvah. He's not saying that you don't need to believe in God. It's a fundamental. It's so fundamental that we have to start with that before we get to the mitzvahs. And now we could start talking about how you love God. How you believe in God? Do you love Him? Do you fear Him? But no one's denying the fundamental principle that you have to believe in God. The question is this counted as one of the 613 mitzvahs? I'll just tell you the three major arguments. The Bahag's argument is like what we said. It has to be a prerequisite. The Abarbanel has a textual proof. The Abarbanel says, if you look in the pasuk, it says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. It doesn't say in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt believe in God. It makes a statement. I am Hashem, your God. Which clearly, in Abarbanel's view, is not a mitzvah. It's not a commandment. It's a statement of fact. And then you have Reb Chasdai Beraxis. Reb Chasdai, who wrote a sefer called Or Hashem in the 15th century, was the strongest of those to reject the Rambam on this idea of belief in God being a commandment, as opposed to being something fundamental. He wrote his book, Or Hashem, to, in his mind, destroy the Aristotle ideas that have been seeping their way into Judaism in his mind. And he believed that a philosophical approach to belief in God is wrong and it is dangerous, and belief in God has to come naturally. Meaning, you don't need...
What year was he?
1538, I think, is when he wrote his works. And we'll discuss all three of these more next week. I just want to get the basic ideas first. So just a very important proof that the Rambam is right, that belief in God is not just a concept, not just a statement of fact, but it's in fact a obligation, a mitzvah, comes from a Gemara. Where do we know that there are 613 mitzvahs? We like to say that, and the code to every shul in the world and every mikvah is 613. But where does this actually? I mean, if people knew that secret, we'll be wiped clean. Where does this come from? It actually is. It's a statement in one place in the Gemara. It's a Gemara in Makos, page Chaf Gimel Amabez, folio 23b. Darash Reb Simloi, Sheish Ma'os Usholosh Esra Mitzvos. There are 613 commandments. Nemrula LaMoshe were told to Moshe at Sinai. And he says, that's why we say, listen to this, Maikra, what verse represents this idea that I just taught? Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. Now, Torah is gematria what? What's the numerical value of Torah? 611. Why? Because who taught the first two mitzvahs in the Ten Commandments? It came from God, and the Jewish nation said, stop, we can't take it anymore. So it's only Torah, only the 611 came from Moshe. Everything else came from God. But what you see from this Gemara is, clearly the first two are counted as one of the 613 mitzvahs. And the first one being belief in God. That's a very direct proof that, according to this Gemara, but we should point out not everybody agrees with this Gemara. I mean, of course, they believe in the Gemara, but because that's only one opinion, that's a pretty obscure Gemara to suggest the principle of 613 commandments. And there are many scholars, and looking in the art scroll tonight, I saw that they also bring this down, that many people try to find arguments to say that we disagree with this Gemara. The most famous is the Ramban. Maimonides, although he finally comes around, in his commentary, the Ramban was such a prolific writer. He wrote commentaries on almost everything. One of them, he wrote a commentary to Maimonides' 613 mitzvahs, how Maimonides calculated 613. He flirts with this idea that maybe there aren't 613. Something that we think is such a principle is not as solid as we think. It became solid, but it wasn't always that way. Another issue relating to the belief in God, sorry, this is in your way, is a contradiction in Maimonides himself. And we'll end with this contradiction, at least for tonight. The contradiction is as follows. In the Yad, in his halachic work, Maimonides says in Hilchos Yisodi HaTorah, Perak Aleph, Halacha Aleph, the Rambam says there is an obligation to know the sharash of Yoda or Yediah. There's an obligation to know God. Because one thing we have to know when you read down Maimonides, this idea of I believe in perfect faith, what does that mean? Do you have to have 100% certainty? What if you believe 90%, 80%? What if you're hedging your bets? You know, Judaism is an okay religion. What do I get if how much do I lose already if I keep it? Worst case scenario is I die and nothing happens, but I lived a very decent life. Family and community and fulfillment. Not because you don't believe in God, but because you have questions. Is that okay? So from the language of Maimonides in the Yad, he says Yediah. Yediah means knowledge. You must know that there is a God. There's no certainty, or at least very little certainty. And at least you could read the Rambam like this. Very quickly, that's how you could read the Rambam. In the Sefer HaMitzvos, when he says he lists the 613 commandments, because we don't know what they are. We just know from this Gemara that there are 613. They have to look in the Torah and start dividing it up. And the Rambam counts belief in God as one of them. He says there's a mitzvah of emunah, to have faith in God. Seemingly a contradiction between the Maimonides and the Sefer HaMitzvahs and Maimonides in the Yad. Does anybody have a suggestion how to answer this contradiction? Is the belief faith, and is the belief knowledge? Did the Rambam not choose his words carefully?
Why can't you have both?
So why didn't he say both? In the Halacha Sefer, he could have said there's an obligation to know and to have faith. And why have faith if you know? I mean, Yediyah really takes care of Amunah. So if it can't be both, can it? Could you actually be obligated to both have faith and to know what?
I mean, Rambam would have, if he were here to talk to, he would say, yes, it is impossible to know that.
You're very confident in yourself. The Rambam will say, the Rambam will say that?
He didn't have conversations with God.
I don't, so ask that as a question. But he does say it.
Maybe he's
So-
not sure.
You actually
Is he
trying
saying,
to know.
is he saying in the Hilchos book that you have to have faith? Is he
No,
saying-
in the Hilchos book he's saying you have to know. I should point out that at the Jewish Discovery Center they had a series of the 10 Commandments, and I was given belief in God, and I spent an hour just on this question, a very intense answer. We're not going to give intense answers in this series if you want to see a more complex approach, but we'll discuss a brief one here.
It seems like there are two different modes of belief. Knowledge is one mode of belief, and faith is another mode.
What do you mean?
Well, knowledge is belief given certain kinds of evidence. Like you get your belief from the evidence, from the justification for believing that the thing that you're believing is true. Whereas faith is belief, over and above and beyond and without evidence.
The way I wrote it was knowledge of and faith in. And you see, Rabbi Bleich, where Ken Davins, when he's not with us, wrote a book called With Perfect Faith, where he wants to give, in his estimation, the Rabbi Bleich is really known today for writing halachic essays, but he wrote this. It's a syllabus for a class he was giving, The Foundations of Jewish Belief. And in the introduction, he really says this idea that anybody you have faith in, whether it's a stockbroker, so your stockbroker comes to you, it's such an elementary example, but it's a good example. He comes to you and he says, I want you to invest, a lot of money into that stock. Now, you have no idea what that stock is. You don't even speak his language, but you have faith in him. You don't know he's right, but you have faith. How do you have faith that he's right? Because of what you know. So because of what you know, you can have faith. And if you think about it, that's really what our belief boils down to. As Dick said, we don't know anything for certain, but what we've known, from what we've seen, we could take that leap. And as the Sfarim say, the goal in life is to make that leap less and less and less. The question is, according to the view that there is such a concept as the idea, how do you get there? And now I promise you I'll end with this. The Ramah says, this is in your day, Reish Mem Vav, the Ramah says, don't start convincing yourself based on philosophical arguments for God. Don't search that way. And he says, you know why? Not because philosophy is bad, just the opposite. That's what Pardes is. We all know Pardes is that term for the orchard that is very dangerous to enter because few leave unscathed. Rabbi Akiva was from the few who was able to enter it and leave okay, because you could get into these discussions and you could stop short and you could end in a very dangerous place. You got to complete that mission. Who said you're going to live long enough to complete that mission? But what's amazing about what he's suggesting is, and he's quoting from the Rambam, is that the philosophical approach to belief in God is the way to investigate this. And that's even the halachic or the hashkafic term of Pardes. And the Vilna Gaon says very famously there, in his footnote, he goes, the Ramah doesn't know what Pardes was or is, and neither does Maimonides. The Vilna Gaon was not a fan of the philosophical approach. That's not a secret. The Rambam was. You could pick a side. Elu ve'elu divrei lekem chayim. Okay, so we will continue next week discussing the boundaries of belief in God. If there is an obligation to search for God, how much of a level of faith do we need to have? We'll also discuss how this applies to non-Jews as well. We'll stop here.